Hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu from Ask Tetsu.
And hello, welcome everyone. My name is Ute Lieberger-Riebold from Ute's International Lounge.
And hello, a warm welcome to everyone from Rita Rosenbach at multilingualparenting.com.
All right. Well, today is a special session in that we had a little rescheduling due to some unforeseen circumstances, but definitely a very, very special session. And it is our tremendous pleasure for us to have Professor Fred Genesee from McGill University with us today to speak about code mixing. It's a big topic in what we do here at Raising Multilinguals Live. So welcome, Professor Genesee. I have like a whole paragraph of things to talk about for you, but instead of doing that, I would like to start this session by having you sort of tell us a little bit about like the story of how this all began for you. I really think that's going to be fun for our audience, which, by the way, we do have quite a few that's getting online right now. So a big shout out to our audience. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. So, Professor, please tell us a little bit about some research highlights, how you got into linguistics and code mixing, the whole story. Please.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And my apologies to those of you who linked in last week, but I was not there. There were scheduling problems. I've just moved recently, so my life is sort of has been in turmoil for a while. So unfortunately, things got very confused. But I'm glad to be here today, and I'm glad you're able to be here as well. Well, yes, my interest in this it really originated in my interest in children who are educated bilingually. So as a graduate student, I did research on children in French, English-speaking children in French immersion programs. And for a number of years, I was involved in evaluating many bilingual programs, immersion programs in the Quebec area. My thesis supervisors were Wally Lambert and Dick Tucker. And so for those of you who know the immersion programs in Quebec will recognize those names because these were the two McGill people who actually worked with parents in Montreal to start those programs. So I was very, very fortunate to be mentored by two of the leading researchers in the field. So I had been involved in doing evaluations of French immersion programs for a number of years. And what we were finding in that research is that children, English-speaking children, could be educated through English and French, a language they didn't know when they started school. And it did not have any negative effects on either their native language development or their academic development, but they learned a lot more French. And this actually flew in the face of a lot of beliefs about bilingualism and bilingual education at the time. So this was in the 1970s, going back a long way. And at the time, there was the general feeling was that to grow up learning one language or to be educated in one language was normal, but being raised or educated in more than one language was not typical or normal. And it was widely believed that there were costs involved in growing up or being educated bilingually. So there, in fact, was research coming out of Ireland, for example, which suggested that English-speaking Irish children in bilingual programs there were experiencing certain academic and linguistic difficulties. And we were not finding that in Quebec. So it sort of set this train of thinking in my mind that there were a lot of beliefs about bilingualism which really underestimated, I thought, what children could do. The general notion was that learning more than one language was a burden for children. And implicit in that thought pattern was that the human neuro-cognitive system is designed to learn one language, but learning more than one language, either in school or at home, would come with a cost. And this sort of piqued my imagination because my research interests have always been motivated not only by theoretical issues and professional issues, but also to some extent by political issues. So I started to think about children who actually grew up bilingually. At the time, there was all research on language acquisition, and really 98% of it was done on children who were learning only one language. So the notion of language acquisition was based on children who learn only one language. And as in the case of bilingual education, a little bit that was published about children growing up bilingually was that there were costs involved in being exposed to two languages in the home from birth. In particular, it was felt that children's language development would be delayed, that they would not be as competent in either one or both languages, and that in the initial phases of language development, children who were exposed to two languages at home would actually be confused. In fact, there was the notion, which was promulgated by researchers in Europe, Voltaire and Teschner, that when children are growing up with two languages in the home, they initially are not bilingual, rather they have a single language system which is made up of elements of both languages. And it was only after 2 or 3 years, they thought, that children separated their languages and could be considered really bilingual. So when I became aware of this research, in fact, the way I got into it, the specific way in which I got into this research was I was asked to write a chapter for a book called Language Development in Exceptional Circumstances. And I was asked to write a chapter on children growing up bilingual, and I said, sure. I had just started to read this research, so quite frankly, I didn't really know a lot about it, but I was interested in learning more. So I wrote my chapter, and in that chapter, I argued that children exposed to two languages were doing fine. And I wasn't really aware at the time that I agreed to write the chapter what the other chapters looked like. And I got a copy of the book, and I was very surprised to see the titles of the other chapters were things like deaf children learning language, children with Down syndrome learning language, children with autism on the autism spectrum disorder learning language, children with cognitive deficits learning language. And I was really shocked because it was clear from the list of titles, chapters in this book, that the authors, the editors of this volume, thought that bilingualism, bilingual acquisition, was similar to language development in children with various kinds of learning disabilities, developmental disabilities.
Wow.
Really believed that, but they may have felt that this was a general belief and therefore it needed to be addressed. And in the midst of this list of chapters was mine on bilingual children. I argued that these children were doing fine. So I was a bit of a black sheep in this family of chapters. But it got
or
me
maybe
very
it was the white sheep amongst the black sheep.
That's right. But it really was, and this was in I can't remember when this was, 1988, 1998. So it was quite shocking, but it really drove home the idea that a lot of people believed that there were these negative consequences to being bilingual. So I thought, this really requires a lot more research. And as I had done research in children learning two languages in school, I thought this would really be an interesting adjunct to that research because it would complement research on bilingual education by looking at even younger children. So when we started, there was a researcher in Germany, Jürgen Meisel, working out, who was also starting to look at bilingual development, and he had a whole team of researchers looking at it. So this research in Hamburg and the research that we started in Montreal were really among the first full-scale studies of bilingual children. And interestingly, for our topic today, one of the main issues that we looked at in the beginning was this issue of code mixing. And the reason for that was because, again, there were these researchers who argued that children learning two languages go through initial stage when the languages are fused. There's not two languages, but only one. And the evidence they used for that was data from the children of the authors, which showed that these children who were learning Italian and German, that they would use words from both Italian and German in the same conversation with the same parent. So in other words, there was lexical mixing of words in a common conversation with somebody, and that was interpreted as evidence that not only were the languages mixed, but the children were mixed up because they couldn't separate the two languages. The notion was that children shouldn't use two languages in the same conversation or in the same utterance, and if they did, it was an indication of confusion. So I reviewed this article quite carefully as part of this chapter that I wrote, and it was not at all clear from their evidence that the reason these children were code mixing was because they were confused. And so that set this whole chain of research that we started looking at code mixing in much more detail. Wow. So that's a long answer to a very short.
But definitely very interesting for us to really see how things develop over time. I remember hearing about this when I was younger from my parents. Like, my parents always had the idea of raising me multilingual, and they were, I would say, very proud of my parents being sort of avant-gardists for that period, which is precisely in the 70s. So, yes. So I know how much headwind they had in those days. Well, when do you think? Would you say is like that period where things transition? Because today, I would say there's much more acceptance on kids speaking more than one language at once. We do still see lots of remnants of this past way of thinking, and even in professionals that we meet. But I would say it's much more widely acceptable today. But was there like a transition period that you think, or some key findings?
Things started to change in the early 1990s. I guess that's when we started this research. Because what had happened was the research on language acquisition was all done on monolingual children. So the theories and the conceptualizations that people had of language development was based on monolinguals. And looking at bilingual children, the few studies that looked at them, these data did not conform to that because these children, in fact, were code mixing. Very young bilingual children, all young bilingual children mix words from the two languages when they're first starting to learn language. And so the interpretation that was put to that data was, well, they're confused. They can't separate the two languages, and they can't separate them because it's too much. So it was widely believed at the time, and maybe even your parents believed this, that if you're raising your child bilingually, then you should follow what's called the one parent, one language rule. That in order to minimize or avoid confusion altogether, each parent, if the child was being raised in a household where each parent spoke a different language, the idea was that if each parent uses only one language with the child, then that will be a clear marker for the child of when Chinese is being used, and when Japanese is being used, or when French is being used, and when English is being used. The fear was that if the parents used two languages with one another or with the child, that the child would not be able to distinguish between the two languages, and that would result in confusion. So to this day, many parents in bilingual families use the one parent, one language rule, and there's no evidence that it's absolutely necessary, but it's not a bad strategy for parents to use, not in order to avoid confusion on the part of the children, but as a way of ensuring that children get exposure to both languages. Because if you're in a bilingual family where one of the languages is the majority language of the community and the other language is a minority language, and that's often the case. So for even in Canada, if the parents speak English and French, English is often the favorite language because it's the majority language across the country. So if you don't have a rule about how to use the two languages with your child, there's a tendency for parents and other people to drift in favor of using the dominant language, and for the minority language will not get used as much. So in order to ensure that each language gets used a lot or equally, then the one parent, one language rule is not a bad idea. But it's not at all clear that children need this in order to separate the two languages. So what we did in order to study this, what we did is we very simply looked at bilingual children. These were children who were growing up in English-French families. One parent spoke English, one parent spoke French. Often they followed the one parent, one language rule. And we very simply recorded the children in conversation, in playing with each parent separately. So we would go into the children's homes. The first time we would go in, we would maybe be with the mother and the child, and we would simply record the children playing with the parents as they would. And we would audio record, video record this for half an hour, 45 minutes. And then we would go back and do the same thing with the other parent. And in these sessions, the parents were told to do whatever they normally would do. And in most cases, most of the parents actually used one language. They didn't code mix a lot. They normally only used one language with the child, so it was perfectly normal. Then we took those, and then we had a session where the child was playing with both parents. So both parents were in the living room with the child on the rug, playing with the child. Each of them was using whatever language they preferred, and we recorded them. And we did that because we wanted to see if the child really is confused, if they really can't separate their two languages, as was argued at the time, then we shouldn't see the child favoring one language or the other when they're speaking with each parent. So even if they're speaking with the English parent, they're going to use English and French indiscriminately. And similarly, when they're with the French-speaking parent, they will use English and French indiscriminately, because if they can't separate the languages, what do they do? And by looking at the children with both parents in the room at the same time, we felt that this was really a very good test of their ability to separate the two languages, because both languages were being used by the parents at the same time. And what we found in all of the children we looked at, for the most part, was that children used more of each parent's language with that parent than with the other parent. So to be clear, if the child was with the parent who normally spoke English, then we found that the children used more English with the English-speaking parent than with the French-speaking parent. If we looked at the child's interaction with the French-speaking parent, we found the opposite. They used more French with the French-speaking parent than with the English-speaking parent. And rather interestingly, and really quite nicely, even when the parents were together with the child, they used more English with the English parent than the other parent, and more French with the French-speaking parent. So even when both languages were being used with the child at the same time, the children were differentiating between the languages that were being used, and they favored the language that the parents favored. So they clearly were able to differentiate. Now, the fact of the matter is they didn't use only French with the French-speaking parent, and they didn't use only English with the English-speaking parent. So they were code mixing. They were using both languages with both parents. It's just that they were using more of the parent's language with that parent than with the other parent. So when we looked at the children's transcripts more carefully, what we realized is that they first of all, they tended to code mix more. This gets a little bit detailed. They tended to code mix more when they were speaking with the parent who spoke the child's less proficient language. So in most cases, bilingual children are more proficient in one language than the other. And in most cases, it's sad to say, it's usually the father's language. Children are more proficient in the language spoken by the mother than the language spoken by the father. And the reason for that is mothers spend more time with their children, and so children are usually more proficient in that language. So what this was telling us is that, look, if they're speaking with the father and the father's language is the language that they're less proficient in, they don't know that language as well. as well. So they're talking away in French. They try to talk about something and they don't have the word in the father's language, but they know the word in the mother's language. So they use the word from the mother's language. So, for example, they might be looking at a picture book. They're using French, and they're saying that's a chat, cheval, and then they come across a picture of an animal, and they don't know the word in French. They know the word in English, a dog. So rather than saying chien, they say a dog because they know the word in English but not in French. So rather than, the really interesting thing about these data, which are really very simple, is that rather than code mixing being a sign of confusion and incompetence, it's actually an indication of how linguistically competent these children are, because they're using all of their linguistic resources to communicate with each parent. If they don't know the word in the father's language, they use the word from the mother's language. And when you live in a bilingual family, that's a reasonable strategy. As they get more and more proficient in the language, they have to do this less and less because they learn more words in both languages. So that was one of the first studies we did, and it was, and then other people did similar research, and it became quite clear that code mixing was not a sign of confusion. It was actually a sign of competence.
Yeah. And maybe you described now very nicely also the code switching, so that when a child speaks with one parent, chooses one language, and with the other parent, the other one, and you now also introduced the term as code mixing. There are some definitions, or sometimes code switching is used as an umbrella term for code mixing and code switching. Can you maybe tell us more about the definition of code mixing and code switching?
Yes, a good question. So people had been looking people who do research on adult bilinguals are also very interested in this phenomenon, and they always use the term code switching. So if you read research that looks at bilingual adults, adult bilinguals, they'll virtually always use the word switching. And the notion of switching implies that when the person is speaking, when they use English, they're in the English system, and then if they use French, they're in the French system. And I'll come back to this point later on. We started this research on bilingual children. We deliberately, I think ours was the first study to do this, we deliberately decided to call it code mixing because we didn't want to assume that what the children were doing was the same as what the adults were doing. So we thought it was safer to use a different term, but basically it's the same phenomenon. And what it is, and there are different kinds of code mixing, code switching. In the case of children, code mixing can take different forms. So in the very early stages of development of most European languages, Romance languages, for example, or Germanic languages, children in the beginning use single words. They don't use multiple words. So you can have what's called inter-utterance mixing, where children will switch from one language to the other, from one utterance to the other. So they'll say something in French, the mother might say something in French, and then the child might respond in English. So that's inter-utterance or interstitial mixing, because the switch occurs from one sentence or utterance to the next. Now, those cases are relatively uncontroversial. The cases that were controversial in the case of children are when the children mix or switch in the same utterance. So, for example, if the child starts off in English and says, can you give me, and then says, un bonbon, give me a candy, but switches from English to French, then it's called intra-utterance, because it occurs within an utterance. Now, these cases are controversial because people think, monolingual people at least think, everything in the same sentence or utterance should be in the same language. So when you switch from English to French, you're breaking the rules in a sense. But that's what we set out to look at. Was this really a problem? So it's really intra-utterance switching that was the controversial stuff. Another form of mixing, which is can occur from one conversation to the other. So in the situation where the child's with both parents, if the child uses English with the mother and then continues the conversation with the father in another language, that's considered a different form of mixing. But the situations that are interesting are the cases of intra-utterance mixing or switching.
Yeah.
Used interchangeably, really.
Yes, and if I understand it right, it's also has to do with the intention that is behind the switching or the mixing in that sense. So that adults, many times they have an intention when they switch from one term to the other and when they mix terms, whereas children seems to be more natural or not necessarily intentional.
Well, I don't know. I think it's not that. I don't think it's that clear cut, because both with children and with adults, they may have an intention or they may not. And often, especially adults, are not sometimes aware that they're even mixing or switching. So it's not uncommon if you, I mean, all of you are probably multilingual. I bet after a conversation with others who are bilingual or multilingual, if I ask you if you were mixing or switching, you don't remember, because it's actually quite, I mean, it's implicit. Similarly, though, children, even very young children, can mix with intention. So we have a brief dialogue with a child, a very young child in the one stage of development, and the child is looking at a picture book, and the mother is asking the child, "What's this? What's this? What's this?" And the mother shows the child a picture of a horse, and the mother is speaking English. So the child says cheval, which is the French word for horse, because presumably the child didn't know the word for horse in English, so it says cheval. And then the mother says, "What is it?" And the child says cheval. The mother says, still doesn't hear it properly, "What is it?" And the child says, "Horse." Said it with a great deal of enthusiasm and sort of almost angry, in order to make the point, "Look, I said this before and I'm going to say it again. That's it." So even very young children can code mix with intention. And it's interesting that adults will code mix for all sorts of reasons, as you point out. But bilingual children, the primary reason that young bilingual children, now I'm talking about children from birth, well, really 1 or 2 years of age to 4 or 5 years of age, the primary reason for them to mix is because they're filling in gaps in their lexical competence. So they're talking away in one language with one parent, and they don't know the words, or they don't know how to express what they're saying in the language of that parent. So they will borrow from the other language. So it's called gap filling. And the most common form of gap filling is lexical gaps. So they don't know the word for horse in one language, so they use the word for horse in the other language. But it's also the case that they might not know how to express something. So for example, in English, when you say how old you are, you say, "I am 7 years old." Whereas in English, you say, "I have 7 years." In other languages are the same. So if you ask a bilingual child how old you are, they might not know how to say it in English, but they would know how to say it in French. So they might say, in English, "I have 5 years." That's not really a lexical gap. That's really a grammatical gap, because they don't know how to express this meaning using totally English grammar. So code mixing can occur at different levels. It can be phonological, it can be lexical, it can be grammatical, or it could even be at the discourse level. The most common form is lexical. And obviously, because very young children don't have a full repertoire of words in both languages, so they're more prone to borrow words when they're from other languages when they're speaking with people. But it's interesting, bilingual children will not, they can control their code mixing. Bilingual children will not code mix very much or at all with people who they know are monolingual. So some studies looking at bilingual children, we looked at them, these were children who were 3.5 to 4 years of age. We looked at them in very short conversations with monolinguals. And the monolinguals that we had interact with them were monolingual in the child's weaker language. English bilingual child who didn't know much English, but we put them in interaction with an English-speaking adult because we want to see what will they do? How can they control their use of the two languages? Because again, this is a sort of indication of whether code mixing is a sign of competence or confusion.
Yeah.
So when you look at them with monolingual adults, they avoid using the language that the monolingual doesn't know. So they tend to stick to the language that the monolingual knows because they implicitly know that this person either prefers one language or knows only one language. So there's a high degree of control that even 3.5-year-olds have over their code mixing.
Mm-hmm. So, and if then a child, for example, mixes, you mentioned there are different levels of code mixing. So on a lexical, on a morphological, grammatical level, I had one of my daughters would use the English sentence structure in German and the German sentence structure in English while she was learning English. So she had already German, but she was learning English, but she was mixing both. So these are, we had the last time, I would like to share this question by Trish van Putten. When do we perceive that code mixing is a problem then? Because it is part of the development of the child that grows up with multiple languages, but what are signs that actually indicate that it is a problem for the child or for the situation?
Well, I've never seen research that indicates that code mixing is ever a problem from a language development point of view. Code mixing is natural. All adult bilinguals code mix and all children code mix. And when they code mix, I've never seen any research that indicates that code mixing by children is an indication of a language problem, a language disability. There's even research out of the US looking at children who are Spanish-English bilinguals who have a language disorder, and the research looked at their code mixing and didn't find any distinguishing features of the code mixing of those children and compared to children who were Spanish-English bilinguals with no language developmental problems. So there's no indication that code mixing is indicative of something that's linguistically problematic. Now, we could argue that it could be problematic from the point of view that the child doesn't have enough competence in one language to express himself or herself totally in that language. So, for example, if a bilingual child goes to school and the school is monolingual and the language of schooling is the language that the child is less proficient in, then the child is going to be handicapped in expressing themselves because they can't say everything they want to say in that language because it's less proficient. So they may hold back. It's not likely that some bilingual children may use the other language, even in a monolingual context, but it's not very common. Children learn very quickly that if everybody's speaking one language, then I should use that language too. It means that these children might not be very verbal. They might not be very conversant in the language, and that could be interpreted as an indication that the child has a language delay or a language. And that's probably, in 99% of the time, that would be a misjudgment. It's probably simply that the child is having to use resources from a language that's not fully developed. You should never, in a family or in a school, and certainly in a school context, you should really never discourage children from code mixing because there's nothing wrong with it. It's a perfectly normal thing to do. Children are doing it because they can. A lot of bilingual children will code mix a lot with other bilingual children because it sets them apart. This is who I am. I'm somebody who knows two languages. I'm with other children who know two languages, so they'll code mix because it's fun. If you're on the bus or the subway in Montreal, a lot of very young people here are very fluent in English, French, or English and Spanish, or French and Spanish, French and English. And it's amazing how much they code mix. And these are adolescents who are fully competent in both languages,
Yeah.
but they code mix because it's a marker of their identity. It's fun. They have fun with the language because the way you express certain ideas in English may be different from in French, and they play with these things.
Yeah.
So as far as I know, I've never seen research that suggests it's really an indication of a language disorder. It might be an indication that the child has not got the proficiency in the language of the classroom that the child needs, and so we need to enrich the child's exposure to that language. But we should never, ever tell these children not to code mix, even in a monolingual context, because they're using whatever linguistic resources they have, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yes, that's very encouraging, I think, for many who are following us. And it was good for me that I knew that my child was doing the right thing, because I also code mix and still code mixed when I was younger, and still do it. As it's, like you say, very reassuring also for me as a grown-up that it's still something that is very healthy.
Well, the other thing I should mention here, which would really drive this point home, there was a whole set of studies we did with bilingual children who are a little bit older. So we started to look at children who were 3 to 4 years of age and 5 years of age. And these were children who were beyond the one-word stage of development. I don't know whether members of the audience know this, but in languages like English and French and German, the first stages of language development, children use single words. Then they slowly progress where they start to use 2 words, and then they start to use 1, 2, 3, 4 words. They gradually expand the length of the utterances that they use, because as they acquire more competence, they learn more words that they can put together, but they also begin to learn the grammar of the language, so they can put words together in a grammatically correct way. So we wanted to look at young bilingual children to see whether when they mix within an utterance, what does it look like grammatically? Because it was this argument that code mixing is a sign of confusion will lead you to believe that when they mix within the same utterance, there's going to be all sorts of grammatical problems with what they do, because they don't know the grammar, they're not separating it, and so on. So we looked at these children, we pulled out the utterances that consisted of 2, 3, or 4 words, and that included words from both languages. And we wanted to look at the grammatical organization of these utterances to see whether they were grammatically legitimate or whether there were lots of problems with them. And amazingly, we found that over 90% of the mixed utterances that they produced were grammatically correct. So I need to explain this a little bit more. So if the children were speaking in English, but they mixed a word from French into that sentence, they would insert the French word into the English utterance in the position that was correct for both English and French. They didn't insert the French word into the English utterance in a way that would violate the English grammatical rule or the French grammatical rule. Okay, this gets quite sophisticated because English and French are quite similar, and finding grammatical differences between these 2 languages is not easy. But the point is, when they did mix, and you analyzed what they said carefully, you could see that they never mixed or they hardly ever mixed in ways that produced grammatical errors in either languages. They only mixed and inserted words from one language into an utterance in the other language where it had the same organization in both languages. So that's really remarkable, because nobody's teaching them how to do this. This is just something that their neuro-cognitive system is figuring out. But it's really quite profound, because what it indicates is that as these children are acquiring these 2 languages, first of all, they're acquiring 2 different grammars, because if you're going to respect the grammatical rules of the 2 languages, you must know those rules, right? So the fact that they didn't switch from English to French and back to English in ways that violated the rules of English, they must know what the rules of English and French are in order to avoid that. Now, this is not conscious knowledge. This is all implicit knowledge. The other thing that's really profound about this, though, is it means that when children are speaking, that the two languages are really like apps. So there's an English app and there's a French app. They're speaking. These two applications are accessible. They're activated at the same time. And as the child is speaking, they're able to do a cross-linguistic analysis. They're not doing this consciously, but they're able to do a cross-linguistic analysis that said, you can code mix here, but you can't code mix there. So they know the two rules and they're activated, they can be activated all at the same time.
So we can say that they are
3 or 3.5 years of age. So this is very young.
We can say that they're demonstrating a highly specific skill when they're doing this.
Yes, that's right. It's so they in comparison to monolinguals who only have one app, these kids have two apps, and they're learning both of them in the same time, basically, as it takes for a monolingual to learn the English app only. And furthermore, there's enough neuro-cognitive power for both of these applications to be operating and for there to be a cross-linguistic comparison of them.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that you teach bilingual children. You have to teach, bilingual children have to learn how to code mix in sociolinguistically sensitive ways. You don't have to be taught how to code mix in grammatically appropriate ways. This is something that the brain does on its own. I mean, it's very clear that very young learners, young children, they have incredible neurocognitive power, and from not only the minute they're born, but before they're born, their brains are looking for patterns in the input that they're exposed to. And so as they hear English and French, they're looking for the patterns in English and French that are the same, and they can identify those that are the same from those that are different. None of this is conscious, it's all implicit, but it's nevertheless knowledge that they have.
Yeah. We have a question from someone who is following us, and it is about how these languages are then activated in the brain. So I know that there have been quite some studies about simultaneous and sequential bilinguals when they are mixing languages. Let me share the question from Whitby, Ari. Is there any evidence for a different representation of the two languages in the brain? That is, can fMRI or any other modality distinguish which language is being spoken? I imagine still in the situation of code mixing.
Well, I'm not as familiar with this research as I could be, but I'm not aware what the brain research on bilinguals shows that the areas of the brain that are involved in processing language in bilinguals are essentially the same as the areas of the brain that are involved in processing a single language. It used to be thought that early on, when people was thinking about this, was really quite simple and naive. At one point it was even thought that one language was in one hemisphere and the other language was in the other hemisphere. We now know that that's absolutely not true, but it's even the case that within the left hemisphere for most individuals, where each language is processed, the same areas of the brain process both languages. So what probably is going on here is that there's a functional differentiation. So the same area is involved, the same set of neurons, but the patterns of activation of those neurons are probably different when it's English versus French versus both. But it's also clear, this has been well documented, that the brain is, both areas of the brain that activate, that are underlying the processing of each language, they're both activated at the same time. The areas of the brain that process the language that's being used is more salient and more active than the area of the brain that processes the other language. But areas of the brain that are involved in both languages are actually activated. So it's like the app example or metaphor that I used. These two apps, they reside in the same areas of the brain. They share brain space, but the patterns of neurons and so on, and that get activated. They're different for the two languages, but they can be activated at the same time. So no evidence to suggest that monolingual acquisition, that the brain was designed or evolved to acquire one language any more easily than to learn two languages. The brain it can acquire two languages as easily as one. But there's also evidence at the same time, it's not the case that the monolingual brain and the bilingual brain are the same. We have research that shows that bilinguals involve the same language areas of the brain as monolinguals, but they also engage other areas of the brain. And often these areas of the brain are involved in cognitive control. So there's more brain activation in the case of bilinguals than monolinguals because they actually activate ancillary areas of the brain that serve to manage the acquisition and use of these two languages. Because the reality is learning two languages involves more cognitive work, in fact.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. It is the first time.
The other thing that's emerging from all this is that research, theoretically, language acquisition researchers are now arguing, usually when you do language acquisition research, you talk about whether somebody's competence in this language is like that of a native speaker. Invariably, when they say native speaker, they mean a monolingual person who acquired one language from birth. And increasingly, there's a lot of research on bilingual children now. Yeah. And increasingly, researchers are saying, we can't use monolinguals as the gold standard for judging what's normal or typical development, because bilingual acquisition is also native-like, but it's different from monolingual acquisition. So for parents, but also especially for educators and clinicians, they shouldn't expect that bilinguals are going to look and sound like monolinguals, and when they sound or look different, it doesn't mean that there's a problem. It just means that they're different, and their brains are different.
Well, thank you so much for that, because I see Rita nodding ferociously here also, because this is something that we get quite a lot as questions from educators and professionals. And while we're in the realm of schools, we do have another question that we received last time from Joanna Suramuga. Let me put this on the screen here. I think this would be relevant at this point. What would you recommend to teachers in bilingual schools where during the language lessons, students mix languages and respond in their stronger language? This is, again, sort of related to what you just mentioned. What do you think? Well, as a teacher, you're teaching a specific language, so you don't want them to mix. Well, what is a good recommendation here?
Now, this is a good question. There's a big controversy now in the field of bilingual education that's around the concept of translanguaging. And the argument is being made that traditionally in bilingual or dual language programs, educators have used a kind of one language policy that during the French part of the day or the German part of the day, teachers and students should use only English or German, and during the English part of the day, they should use only English. And the rationale for that is that for the students to learn their second language, say they're English-speaking kids and they're in a German immersion program, if they're going to learn German, they have to use the language. Because if you don't use the language, you're not going to learn it. So, and children, like adults, have a propensity to want to use the language they already know because it's much easier. So in order to provide lots of opportunities for the students to learn the second language, to use it and learn it, they make rules. So when you're with the German teacher in the German classroom, you use only German. And so there's this monolingual model set up. And there's a lot of merit in that, because I know that in our programs, our English-French programs, if you didn't require the students to use French during the French portion of the curriculum, the instruction, they would use English all the time. Therefore, they wouldn't learn French. So there is a rationale to do that. But we now know, and this goes back to sort of some of the neuro-cognitive research, this monolingual model of bilingual education presupposes that the two languages of bilinguals are actually separate. And they're not. one language promotes that language, using the other language promotes that language, and there's no interaction between. But we now know that there's a lot of interaction between the two languages of bilinguals, especially during development. So educators are increasingly calling for the use of both languages during instructional time. So you can use French or English, regardless of whether it's the French time or the English time. Now, my argument would be this depends on the status of the language and the population of students you're talking about. If you've got a bilingual program where the majority of the students or all of the students are speakers of a majority language, and say it's English and French, or English and German, or English and Vietnamese, you don't need, they have to be given opportunities to learn use the other language in order to use it. So in that context, I think it means keeping the languages separate as much as possible. On the other hand, you have dual language programs, as they do in the United States, where the students speak a minority language. So these are Spanish-speaking children who may also speak English, and they're in Spanish-English programs in the US. So keeping the languages separate there makes less sense, because you want to encourage the use of Spanish as possible. So allowing the kids to use Spanish during the English time, to me, is okay, because Spanish is otherwise neglected. So if you've got a minority language and minority language speakers, allowing more translanguaging makes sense. But if your speakers are majority language speakers, allowing them to use the majority language doesn't make sense. But I also think that you should never allow, well, never a strong word, you should discourage allowing the students to use their stronger language if they're in a period of the school day where their second language is being used, simply because they don't know the language yet. In other words, don't allow students to rely on the first language to make it easier in the second language classroom. I don't know whether that makes sense.
Yes.
No, it makes perfect sense.
In our school programs, if you're in the French period of the day, if they don't know how to say it in French and they can do it in English, of course they're going to do it in English. They'll never learn the French ways of talking about this stuff. Compelling them to do it in English, and compelling you as a teacher to scaffold their development so they can do it in French enhances their French language development. And it's very, very important that you do this from the very beginning, because I've seen lots of classrooms where the teachers allow the students to use English in the primary grades. Say they're in a math class, she's teaching something new that's difficult, and the kids have trouble talking about it or expressing themselves in French. So she allows them to use English, and she may even use English. The problem is when you get to grade 5 and 6, the students have not got the linguistic competence French to handle the material at the grade 5 or 6 level. So you have to do it in English. So you really, if it's a majority language student and you're talking about the majority language, I don't think you should allow that language to be used freely, because it will discourage students from learning the other language. And you should never do it, even with minority students, just to make it easy, because making it easy now will make it difficult later on. I'm not sure if that's clear. It's a very complex.
It's very clear.
It's very clear. I mean, while we're talking about keeping the languages separate, last time we had the comment from Faf Helal. He's from North America, and he was speaking about language purism.
North Africa.
North Africa, sorry,
yes.
Did I say America? North Africa, and they're speaking about language purists keeping the languages separate on the societal level, where the elite, as he expressed this, view the languages as distinct from each other, and they shouldn't be mixed. So what would you? Because that's not how people use languages in North Africa. So what would your comment be on that?
Well, and it is complex, and I've given you some thoughts about one aspect of this issue. It's a very complex issue. I think that and I'm speaking primarily from a North American point of view, I think that in dual language programs, especially if it's in a community where children are exposed to both languages outside school, I think we need to devote much more time in school to teaching children about code mixing and code switching in the societal sense, and to show them the value of this, what code mixing means, to teach them that it's appropriate in some situations but not in other situations. So one of the problems, for example, in a minority language situation, if you go too far and encourage the students to use only the minority language, and they're not learning the majority language, you create a problem, because when they leave school, they will have to know how to use the majority language without code mixing a lot. So I think we need to be devoting a lot more time in school to recognizing that code mixing is a reality, that it's a great thing that bilinguals can do, that it follows certain rules, and that it's appropriate in some situations and maybe not in other situations. And we may even want to build in time into the lessons where we show children, students, the correspondences between the language that they were just taught in to the other language. So there's a concept that was developed in the US called bridging. So say you're teaching a science lesson in Spanish. So it goes on in Spanish. And then for the last 5 or 10 minutes of the unit or the lesson, you set aside time and you're going to say, now we've done all this in Spanish, let's look at how it might be done in English. So you might say, here are some technical terms that you've learned now in Spanish. Does anybody know the English terms? How do we say this in English? It might also be grammatical. So, you know, in Spanish, we ask questions in this way. How do you ask the questions in the other language? So that you set aside time when you're not only making children aware of some of these cross-linguistic similarities and differences, but you're allowing them to express what they know about these cross-linguistic relationships. I think that we've gone way too far in separating the two languages, and we need to create more space where it can be recognized, that it can be enjoyed, but I think we need to always have a purpose for doing it. There's a lot of arguments that are made in minoritized community situations where there's a call for allowing children to use all of their linguistic resources because it's an expression of who they are. And if we compel them to use only one language or the other, it's sort of like continuing to colonize these groups. And I agree, there's a lot of merit in that. But I think that the answer to those situations is not just to open things up completely and say, just use whatever language you want. I think that there are other strategies that you can use in order to validate those languages, to validate those learners, and to teach children about code mixing. Children are fascinated by cross-linguistic differences. But we devote very little time in class to actually talking about it with them. And I think we should spend more time on it.
Yeah, I think what you just said, I always see the analogies between how it can be done in classrooms and how it's actually also happening in multilingual families, where you also make free some time to dedicate to one of the minority languages or both, and you agree on certain language use patterns or certain moments where you have time and place or per subject that you are speaking about, I don't know, school issues in the school language or in the other language, where we see these correspondence between school and home that can be maintained in both realities or worlds where the children go back and forth. So that is quite helpful to see how this can be somehow combined. And that also reassures the child, because often when we have minority languages only at home, maybe 2 or 3, validating these languages also at school will only benefit, well, also the other languages. But yeah,
that's right. I've been in bilingual classrooms. It was Italian and English, but the students themselves spoke multiple languages. The languages of instruction were English. And the teachers were brilliant at drawing attention to and validating all of the other languages that were spoken by the students. So I sat in on a math class that was in, I forget whether it was Italian or English, but as the teacher was teaching the new concepts and skills, she knew that she had some children in the classroom who spoke Greek or Serbian or whatever. So she was teaching division. So she said, so do you know how to do division in Serbian? Do you know how to do division in Greek? Because, you know, you do it differently in different languages. This came as a big shock to me as an Anglophone, that not everybody did division in the same way. But so she would have these children stand up and say, well, in Serbian, this is how you count, or this is how you multiply, or this is how you do this. And the other kids were fascinated by it. So it was a brilliant way of validating that student, of saying, look, here's a student who speaks a third language, and this is something he does, but you can't do. So he's validated, so it enhanced everybody's appreciation for other languages, but it also enhanced their metalinguistic awareness, which was beneficial for all of the students.
Yeah.
It's complex. This whole business of multilingualism, I always say to people, it's not a problem for children.
No,
Children can handle it. The challenge is for adults. How do you manage the situation so that children can learn as much as possible?
That's such a great way to summarize it, this whole discussion, I think. And I want to say, you have this uncanny ability to make this frontline research, cutting edge research, really accessible to our audience. And we want to thank you for all your insights today. And in a way to sort of wrap things up as we pass the hour right now, I'd like to ask you one last question, and to really bring this to our parents who are watching, the real frontline users, I think, of this information. As you know, oftentimes parents are concerned when they see their kids mixing languages. You know, the first reaction sometimes may be negative. So what would you say to them, I think, as a general message to encourage them throughout this whole process?
To encourage parents.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say that, I guess that I would say, first of all, just what I've just said is that learning two languages is not a problem for children. They can do it. We know that. And in the right circumstances, it can be as easy as learning one language. And it can happen without jeopardizing the development of the majority language, which is often the concern of minority parents. But I would also say that if you, and raising your child in the minority language can be really critical for their social well-being and their social development. Because in families where the parents are worried that using the minority language will jeopardize the child's development of the language, so you restrict their access to the minority language, this can create problems for children in families where members of the family speak only the minority language. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that for minoritized children, learning two languages actually enhances self-confidence, it enhances social well-being, it enhances communication within the family. If the parents are more comfortable in the minority language, that's the language they should use with their child so that they can play an appropriate parenting role. If they feel that they should be using the majority language and they don't know that language, that's not a good idea, because they can't really be full-fledged parents doing that. So I think that parents who want to use a minority language in the home keep reminding themselves that children can do it, and the extra effort that's needed to make this happen really has to come from me as the parent, to create an environment in the family which will support the development of the minority language. There is absolutely no risk that children in that situation will not learn the majority language. Yeah. Children of immigrant parents always learn the majority language. There's no risk that they're not going to learn that language. They have to learn that language because they're surrounded by it outside home. So what parents need to do if they want the child to learn the minority language is they really need to support that language as much as they can in the home. And in some cases, that's going to take a lot of work, because there may not be a lot of resources outside the family to do that, but it can be done. but it can take a lot of it requires some focus and energy on the part of parents. But children can do it. It's not a problem for them. And in the long run, I think they will benefit from it because they will have a broader communication skills and they will have a greater sense of well-being. So it's well worth doing. But I have to say that in some cases, you have to assess whether the other language is important for the family and the child, and important enough to really stick at it. And if it is, stick at it.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so message to the parents: the kids can do it. Can you? I guess that's right. How to summarize it.
Yes, and I think the last thing that you said, Professor Genesee, was also when there is a need, that it can be possible. Because we had one other question, I'm not going to show it, but there was someone asking, is there anything like too many languages, or is there any sign, or in what situation is it warranted to recommend removing a language? I think you answered this question. If there is not a need for the child to speak it, to learn it, to improve it, then this is something to think about, right?
Yeah, that's an important point. In Canada, we have a lot of English-speaking families that are very enthusiastic about their children learning French because it's one of the official languages and it's a very important world language. So some of these parents find themselves in a situation where they can't get the French services they want in school, or they can't get a French immersion program in school, and they really push for more French and more French services and so on. And I often say to these parents, look, or it may be a child who has a language disability, and the school system has support. I don't think this is a good situation, but it's common. If the schools only offer support in English and the child can't get support in French, I always say to these parents, you really need to assess, is French important to your children? If there's a compromise between learning French, which isn't important for your child now or in the future, as opposed to getting high quality support in English, then you need to decide between those two, because unfortunately, in this community you're in, you can't get both. So I want to reinforce the point you made. Bilingualism is great, but it's not necessarily for everybody. And whether you as a child or as a parent or as an educator go for bi or multilingualism, you have to factor in the importance of knowing that language. Mm-hmm. Because it's not equally important for everybody.
No.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Genesee. It has been a tremendous honor for us to have you on and share your insights. This is really, really beneficial for all our viewers. And again, a shout out to all our viewers who have been watching us on Facebook and on YouTube. Sorry again for the rescheduling, but you have been there and you've asked your questions. And if you want to continue asking questions, please do go ahead and write them in the comments, and we'll try to get to them after the fact. And we also have a little feedback sheet, so it's running on the ticker right now, and you can find the link in the description of this video. So please do give us some feedback so that we can improve and get better content to you each time. So
can't get much better than this.
Then maybe we should stop the show now.
Very kind.
This is the last one. So thank you. We do have one more scheduled next week, so I will pass the baton to Rita to tell us about our next session. Give me a little second here, and we will put it. What am I doing here? Let me share this screen. There you go.
And as soon as Petko can get his things together, I will speak about let's talk about language heritage language anxiety. We touched upon the importance of home language. We can sometimes use the word heritage language, and next session we will speak exactly about this, because it's real and it happens in families when there is an expectation, an attempt, maybe failed attempt, to learn the heritage language. So to speak about this is Yejim Sevinch. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Multilingualism in Society Across the Lifespan, also called Multiling, at the University of Oslo. She focuses on the topic of linguistic, social, psychological, pedagogical, and physiological aspects of multilingualism. That is right about everything about multilingualism, but with special focus on minority contexts. She also includes factors such as motivation and emotion, identity-based anxiety, beliefs and attitudes, and how all these factors interact in influencing multilinguals' daily lives. So we will ask her a question. You ask her to explain what it is and what happens to people that experience it, and what if there is something that can be done to prevent it and how we can cope with it. So please join us on our regular date of Tuesday, the 18th of May at 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. in Paris.
Thank you very much, Rita. Again, a huge thank you to everybody involved in bringing this show to our audience. Thank you, Professor Genesee, for making the time. We know that you are extremely busy, and thank you for sharing your insights today with us. Okay.
Thank you very much.
We're ready to see everybody again next week. Of Code Mix right here, our main bust next week, same channel, same time on Tuesday. Well, not same time, same time as usual on Tuesday. Okay. See you, everybody.
Bye.
Alla prossima.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Volgende keer.